So broadly, my research looks at how adults talk with young children about challenging social issues, things like violence, racism, gender, etc. A lot of teachers will tell me, I don't do a lot of teaching about those topics, not explicitly. But what my research reveals is that kids are learning about the meaning of gender and race all the time through their experiences with engaging with the books and curricular materials in the classroom, through their relationships with other students, and through their relationships with teachers. Who do teachers call on? Who has power in a classroom, and how is it distributed by teachers and school staff? I think a lot of it happens through kids teaching each other and through the implicit messaging of teachers. In particular, I think with gender, in schools, kids learn that there are two gender categories. They learn that through the structure of school facilities like bathrooms, through athletics, through their curricular materials, and their interactions with other people at school. The reality is that gender is a lot more complicated than that, both scientifically and socially. There's a lot of different ways to be a man or a woman or a girl or a boy or trans or non-binary in society. And I think that we do children a disservice when we do not invite them into the full complexity of the meaning of gender and race in society. It raises a larger question of what does it mean to be an educator? We have kids in these schools for 8 hours a day, and what do we do with that time? Do we think about the most urgent questions facing us as a society and wrestle with those, practice different ways of being together in classrooms that might imagine a more just and equitable society? Or are we sort of just continuing to impose the same traditional structures on kids that we know are restrictive? By engaging children in a process of respectful and caring inquiry about the world from their earliest experiences in schools, they will be able to greet difference throughout their lives with a respectful curiosity and care that can support the cultivation of a less violent world. That's what this comes down to. It's figuring out how we can relate to each other in shared space without doing harm to one another.
But we could sort of finish off by talking about the paper that I mentioned last week. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but you were talking about the manipulation tactics. Let me just bring up something here. The reason these papers are important is because they have quite a lot of influence. And a lot of this influence in intersectionality, critical race theory, queer theory, a lot of these social justice topics really they very much come from the top down. So this is what I was talking about earlier. You have this inner circle, and the inner circle are those who have influence, who want to maybe take control of something. That could be, for example, a publication that decides that it wants to disseminate more critical social justice for whatever reason. So they're only going to accept papers that mention it or have an element that takes that into account, for example. But with the papers that you might read, the academic papers, these are pretty much this is the inner school, right? So these are the people who kind of make or turn the ideas into an actual theory or doctrine. And so this is where all of this critical theory comes from, this queer theory comes from. It is from the academics. And they really understand in very intrinsic detail exactly exactly how much to talk about, how to talk about it, how to disseminate, how to write about it, how to put it into policies, how to then get other people to adopt it. And what we see on the ground is under here, this outer school. Of course, you see these angry people here. So that can obviously represent the trans activists on the ground getting very upset at people going to all these protests. It can represent that. But it doesn't just represent those angry people. It also represents a whole lot of people who have taken on these ideas, who don't understand that the doctrine that they've taken on board is a top-down indoctrination process. So that could be a parent who discovers whose child has told them they're trans and they want to be kind, and so they decide that they're going to go with it, and they do love is love, and trans women are women. They do all the mantras, and they don't understand that where that's coming from influence the way that they think. And a lot of people are in this category now, especially in Canada, who don't think too deeply about it and think this is just about being kind. So this could be just teachers who are just trying to be kind in the classroom. A lot of people are in this outer school. Now, I focus my attention personally on this inner school because I think this is a source of a lot of the trouble. And even though some of these papers may not necessarily get a whole lot of views, they influence a lot of people. For example, well, the last time I talked about a paper, I think it was a week before last, I talked about the Drag Queen Story Hour Defense, I suppose, by Harper B. Keenan. He was part of the academics doing the SOGI dissemination. So he does actually have quite a lot of influence. The other most recent paper that they had on the actual SOGI website at the UBC was this methodology as pedagogy, trans lives, social science, and the possibilities of educational research. So this paper is actually aimed at Americans. It's not aimed at Canadians. I brought it up because it is Keenan, our friend Harper B. Keenan from the UBC. But it's the content of this paper as well, the inner school ideas in this paper that I thought were particularly interesting. I'm not going to have time to go through everything, but I just wanted to go through some of the things in here. So the paper is generally summarizing that trans awareness is on the rise, that there's a lot of pushback against that rise. And a lot of it is phobic, transphobic, all this stuff. And that because of that, there's an increase in interest by the educational researchers and educators to then start becoming or introducing this into the classroom to prevent some of this rise in transphobia. So that's kind of the point of the paper. Here's a quote here. Although the targeting of trans people has dramatically intensified, gender surveillance and regulation are hardly new. So this gives you a tone of kind of how he goes on in this paper. By the way, Harper Keenan writes pretty well. So if you're interested in understanding the ideology behind what's coming down to the regular people, he's pretty good to read. This is just setting the scene, explaining to you that we've been really critical of trans people for a long time and trying to indoctrinate them into becoming not trans, basically, or heteronormative.
Nuts.
So the paper does point out that the term transgender was pretty much only coined in the 1990s, even though the whole paper is about the history of being transgender. And the assumptions here are that trans people have always existed. It's always been a thing, even though it was only coined in the 1990s. And it sort of starts off with a history of how transgender has been rejected by society. A lot of that, it comes from this post-World War II pre-World War II eugenics movement. So this was a thing. There was this idea that to make people conform to what was viewed as the height of civility with the eugenics movement. That was a thing. But trans, as it were, or people who were gender nonconforming, they weren't targeted in the way that they'd like to believe they were. A lot of people were targeted by the eugenics movement. And today, this is not continued. So this is the framework for one of the things I'll talk about in a minute, that the Eurocentric white supremacy, whiteness framework that they feel underpins this hate for trans people. It's all about white supremacy because of this pre-World War II eugenics. But we've moved on from that. Another point that I thought was interesting is that in the transgender movement or the gender queer movement, they often still idealize John Money. So in this paper, Harper does talk about John Money. He says researchers like John Money argued that chromosomes and gonadal structure were not reliable predictors of a person's gender role. Instead, pointing to assigned sex and socialization is more impactful in shaping a person's self-concept. This is the idea of the clean slate. The idea that people are born a clean slate and they become who they are by societal expectations, right?
This is programming and social construction. Yeah.
Right.
For viewers for viewers who don't know who John Money is, at the top of your mind, John Money was a sexologist, not a doctor, and he was at Johns Hopkins in the 1960s. And there was a case of Canadian boy. He was a twin.
David Reimer.
And I remember seeing David Reimer on Oprah Winfrey in the 90s. There was an accident in circumcision, and Reimer's penis was so badly damaged it was irreparable. And John Money said, not to worry. The parents sought out some expertise, and Money was the person they settled on, and who said that, okay, not to worry, just raise him as a girl, and at the right time we'll have appropriate surgeries and will feminize him, and that's fine because gender is social construction. Now, in the 60s and 70s, there was still a debate in the field of psychology and psychiatry about nature versus nurture, and nature being this blank slate or empty slate notion of the world, that human beings are born to be programmed and are fully programmed by their environment, and there's no nature at all. And then on the nature side, everything, the argument was that everything is kind of predetermined. It's temperament, it's personality, it's on board, and then we just kind of navigate the world with our temperaments. Now, I had the privilege of raising 4 kids, and each one from birth had a different personality and a different temperament. It's pretty obvious if you're a parent and you've done this, if you have lived on a farm and seen how a litter of kittens or a litter of puppies grows up and has different temperaments, it's really hard to argue social constructionism. Now, the debate was more or less settled, and it's neither one nor the other, but both. But what's happened with John Money's beliefs, and sadly, David Reimer committed suicide. His life was a really sad story of trying to come to terms with what happened to him. And it's worth reading. Helen Joyce's book, Trans, I believe, goes into it quite some length. But David Reimer was a victim of John Money. And the whole trans activist social construction theory missed Psychology 101 course, where they taught the nature and nurture debate and the resolution and what we've come to understand about nature and nurture. They believe 100% in nurture.
They didn't miss it. They were there. They just dismiss it entirely. The argument is, I mean, with the trans gender as a social construct, they argue that David Reimer committing suicide and never feeling like the girl he was supposed to be raised as was proof that he wasn't living his gender identity, and that created suicide. And so they kind of argue around that. But the point is that John Money is still... Well, John Money is still viewed as a really important figure for trans ideology with this clean slate idea, even though for regular people that's pretty much been debunked. Again, here with just to touch on, the early social scientific study was used to analyze gender nonconforming behavior in order to eliminate it, in large part because it was perceived as a threat to the preservation of white supremacy through heterosexuality. So that's kind of what I was alluding at here. There's so much talk in this paper about cis heteronormativity originating from white supremacy. So remember, I'm talking about the inner school here, and that disseminates and creates policies that goes down the ladder into schools, primary schools even.
Yeah.
Oh, give me a second. Okay, so I had a little look at some of the intersectional ideas in this paper. I found that this is 5 pages long, by the way. It's not a huge paper. So whiteness, white supremacy, Eurocentric, imperialist, these words came up 13 times. Transgression only came up once, which I was kind of surprised at. Transgression really talks about queerness as a political identity. Transgressing is the political aspect of that. Cis, heteronormativity, and normativity came up 17 times. Colonialism came up 7 times. Liberation only 3 times, which I found kind of surprising. But oppression came up 5 times. So this whole paper really is based on the idea that, like, as we were discussing in this episode, you essentially choose to become queer because you are shedding the oppressor, that Eurocentric white supremacist oppressor in society. I'll just pull out one example because quite a few. So here they say, it's crucial that educational researchers seeking to study gender are aware that 1, Eurocentric ideas about gender have been made justifiable through academic research and scholarship. 2, that these ideas have pathologized transgender existence, transgender only having been a thing since the 90s. Number 3, that while the gendered structures of white supremacy have been imposed upon virtually all people in colonial societies, the design of these structures has historically served to facilitate the reproduction of white and wealthy ruling class.
Marxism.
So it's queer Marxism. Yeah, Marxism didn't come up once in this, but in the Drag Queen Story Hour, they do point out over and over and over how queer is a political identity. What is that political identity? It's a Marxist identity. It's what it is.
Wild. I'll let you finish up because I want to plug the book that Eva contributed to before we close out today's Gender Wars report.
I'll stop here. I won't continue, but I will say, why is this important? So if I bring your attention back to that image that I showed you with the inner circle, the inner school, and the outer school, why it's important because the academics are being taken over by critical social justice. Okay, this is crushing critical thinking. Now at university, we often talk about critical thinking or put critical thinking on a pedestal, as it should be in many respects, because it helps us understand the world and progress in our knowledge of the world. But critical social justice isn't critical thinking. Critical thinking requires you to gather all of the information. Don't apply your own bias to that information. Some of it might disagree, but you gather all the information and you analyze that information based on how robust it is. And you come up with your own conclusion based on analyzing that information.
Weighing the evidence and looking at the full
the big picture.
The range of information available, yeah.
And be prepared to change your opinion based on that information. That's what critical thinking is. And that's how I was educated in the UK. I wasn't educated in Canada. So I think this makes a bit of a difference for me to be able to see this. But that's what critical thinking is. And it's a skill, and it's not really obvious because we do have bias. Critical thinking is a skill that must be learned and practiced over time. And you must be willing to change your opinion based on what you see if the evidence is strong enough. However, critical social justice, despite having the name critical in it, is not critical thinking. What it does is that it starts with an answer. Now, that answer is white supremacy is controlling, is the cause of everything. Cis heteronormative is the cause of everything. So it already has an answer. That's what the critical is. What they mean by critical is that you criticize something until you get it to fit into the answer. They're putting the cart before the horse.
Yep.
So you start with the answer and you make things fit into the answer. And those things that cannot be confirmed by your answer, they're dismissed outright.
Or they're manipulated and bullied out of existence, right? This is why we have this cancellation culture, because anything that doesn't fit within the paradigm, within the accepted presupposition of existence, as I was talking about earlier, must be silenced. It justifies extreme censorship.
Precisely. So I just wanted to make that point here. So this is why I take a particular interest in the academics, because I think they have a really important role, even though most people don't necessarily understand that these ideas can be very, very, very powerful. And if we understand where they come from, we can address the problems better. So yeah, go read his papers. They're quite entertaining. Thanks for watching to the end. Please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring you more content like this. And here's a couple suggestions you might like.